I never thought my words would come back to trap me, but the morning my cards were declined at the grocery store, I realized Ethan had frozen everything without warning. He stood in the doorway with his lawyer's folder in hand, calm and steady, while I tried to understand how silence had turned into power. I had once laughed in front of friends that my body belonged to whoever tried, saying it made me free and untouchable, and everyone chuckled as if I was brave for speaking out loud. At 34, I worked as a receptionist in a dental office, and I believed attention from men like Liam at the pub proved I was still exciting and alive. Ethan at 38 was quiet and careful, a math teacher who tracked every detail, and I told myself his calmness meant weakness. We had 2 children, Maya, who was 10, and Jonah, who was 7, and I claimed I carried the emotional weight while Ethan only cared about order and money. My sister Tessa encouraged me to play around while I was still young, while my mother Marla told me the house mattered more than marriage, repeating that property lasts longer than love. Ethan's parents, Sylvia and Walter, never liked me, and their sharp eyes always felt like they saw straight through me, especially when I joked too loudly. I thought Ethan's silence meant I could twist the story any way I wanted, but the frozen accounts and legal papers showed me I had been wrong all along. The first time things really cracked was during a backyard dinner we hosted for a few neighbors and relatives, and I remember standing there with a drink in my hand while Ethan tended the grill like he always did, quiet and steady, while I felt the urge to remind everyone that I was the lively one. The evening was warm, laughter was easy, and I had already decided in my head that I would be the center of attention, so I leaned back in my chair and announced that my body belonged to whoever tried, and the shock on people's faces quickly turned into awkward laughter. I smirked because I thought I had been bold, and my sister Tessa clapped her hands while telling me she admired my honesty, which made me feel powerful. My mother Marla shook her head, but added that men should work harder if they wanted to keep their wives satisfied, and I used her words like a shield for what I had said. Ethan's mother Sylvia frowned and set her fork down sharply, excusing herself from the table, while Walter stayed behind with a stern look that said more than any words could. Maya sat with her sketch pad at the children's table, and later she asked me quietly why Daddy had looked so sad when everyone laughed, but I brushed her off by saying he was tired from teaching. Jonah clung to Ethan's side during the goodbyes, and I joked that children always stuck to whoever spoiled them, ignoring the way Ethan's shoulders stiffened as he carried plates inside. When the last guest left, Ethan moved through the kitchen silently, stacking dishes and wiping counters without speaking, while I lounged in the living room, feeling triumphant that my joke had landed. I noticed the red light blinking on the outdoor camera, but I dismissed it because Ethan liked recording small family moments, and I laughed to myself, thinking he had probably captured my best side. Sylvia stopped on her way out, looked me squarely in the eye, and used my full name like a warning, but I rolled my eyes and told myself she was only being dramatic. Later that night, Ethan asked calmly why I would humiliate him like that, and I snapped back that he had no sense of humor and that everyone had laughed, which should have proved me right. He said nothing more, only walked out to the garage, and I told myself his silence meant surrender, not realizing it was the opposite. Over the next few days, he became even quieter, not joining in conversations at dinner, not engaging with me beyond what was necessary, and I felt annoyed rather than guilty. I messaged Tessa complaining that he was sulking, and she replied that I should enjoy my freedom instead of worrying about his moods, which fueled me further. Marla told me again that the house was the most important thing, repeating that I should never give it up no matter what happened, and her advice felt like permission. Ethan spent more and more evenings in the garage, and when Maya asked why, I told her he was fixing shelves, though I knew he was moving boxes and stacking papers. At work, I entertained co-workers with exaggerated stories about my stingy, boring husband, and they laughed with me while I felt clever and untouchable. Liam, the bartender, who sometimes delivered supplies to our office, leaned against the counter and told me I deserved better, and I let his flattery wash over me like proof I was right to chase attention. I told him Ethan was rigid and dull, and that I was too young to settle into a life of silence, and he smiled as if to confirm my story. That smile became my little prize, something to hold on to when I felt annoyed by Ethan's steady quiet, and I convinced myself it was harmless. One evening, I walked past the garage and saw Ethan sitting with his phone, the camera app open, and I watched him press the save button before sliding it into his pocket. My stomach fluttered for a moment, but I pushed it away, telling myself he was sulking and hoarding clips of me being dramatic to pity himself later. I laughed about it to Tessa, saying he was probably building a library of my best moments, and she told me again that I had the upper hand. That night, as I switched off the porch light, I saw a delivery van slow in front of our house before rolling to the neighbors, and I caught myself wondering if it might stop to hand me something heavy. I shook the thought off, poured another glass of wine, and told myself nothing could touch me, because I was still the one with the jokes and the attention. What I refused to see was that Ethan's silence was no longer weakness, but a careful preparation, and each saved clip and each quiet evening in the garage was another step towards something I had no power to stop. At the dental office, I slipped easily back into my role of greeting patients and filing paperwork, but underneath I was restless, craving excitement wherever I could find it, which is why Liam quickly became more than a harmless distraction. He was younger, full of easy charm, and every time he dropped off supplies, he lingered at the counter, asking about my day, as though my words mattered more than his schedule. I told him Ethan was dull and stingy, obsessed with bills and routines, and Liam chuckled that I deserved more, which made me feel noticed in a way I had convinced myself Ethan no longer managed. Soon, I was staying late under the excuse of finishing reports, sitting in the break room with Liam drinking sodas and laughing at jokes while Ethan thought I was still working. When Ethan asked why I came home so late, I said I had to handle unexpected overtime, and when he raised an eyebrow, I accused him of being controlling. Tessa encouraged me with constant messages, saying I should enjoy my youth before it slipped away, and I clung to her words whenever guilt tried to surface. Marla warned me lightly to be cautious, but repeated that the house mattered more than anything else, which I twisted into permission to continue enjoying the thrill. Sylvia, however, grew sharper and asked Ethan directly if he believed me about working late, and though I did not hear his reply, the look she gave me afterward burned like an accusation I could not shake. Liam posted a photo from the pub one night, and my bracelet was visible on the table beside his drink. But I only giggled and told myself Ethan would never notice such a small detail. The next evening, Ethan quietly asked why my phone location had shown the pub when I claimed to be at work, and I snapped that the app must have glitched, twisting the blame onto technology. He nodded and wrote something in his small notebook without another word, and his calmness unsettled me, far more than if he had shouted. I later told Tessa that he was probably journaling about how mean I was, and we laughed together as if his silence was proof of weakness. At school pickup, one of the mothers asked kindly if everything was all right, saying Ethan looked exhausted, and I barked back that people should worry about their own lives. Maya asked during dinner why Daddy never smiled anymore, and I told her he was simply tired, though the way her eyes studied me made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. Jonah began clinging to Ethan's hand at bedtime, and I teased that children always favored whichever parent spoiled them, though inside I felt a twinge I quickly smothered. I kept telling myself I had the upper hand because I could twist stories, make jokes, and turn people against him if needed, while Ethan's silence looked to me like surrender. One evening, I told Liam that being with him felt like proof that I was free, and I added that Ethan would never dare leave me because he needed me too much. Liam laughed and leaned closer, and that laughter became my comfort when Ethan's quiet stare felt heavy at home. But what I did not realize was that Ethan's notebook was no diary of sadness. It was a log of every late night, every expense, and every contradiction I had offered. Each word I mocked and every lie I thought clever was being written down with the same careful patience he used when balancing numbers at school. I still believed I could charm or laugh my way out of anything, but the truth was already stacking against me in silence, waiting for the right moment to rise. The night of a co-worker's birthday at the Stag's Tail should have been light-hearted, but I turned it into another performance because I craved being the center of the room. And once again, Ethan became my target. We sat at a long table under dim lights while plates and glasses cluttered the wood, and Ethan stayed quiet at the far end, focused on his meal, while I leaned forward with a grin. I told everyone that my body belonged to whoever tried, adding that Ethan was too cautious and stingy to understand a woman like me, and the table erupted in laughter that made me feel powerful. Ethan's jaw tightened and he asked quietly if we could leave, but I waved him off and announced to everyone that he was sulking again, which brought more chuckles and whispers. Tessa cheered and told me I was right to live my truth, and her words pushed me to double down, making another joke about how boring life could be with a man who thought bills mattered more than adventure. Ethan stood slowly, placed money on the table for both our meals, and walked out without looking back, leaving me basking in attention I thought I controlled. Liam was behind the bar polishing glasses, and he gave me a subtle nod that made my chest warm, as if I had just proven something only he and I understood. After dinner, he walked me part of the way to my car, and even though I knew people might notice, I let it happen because the risk gave me a thrill I mistook for freedom. The next morning, Sylvia called and demanded to know if I thought humiliating her son in public was entertainment, and I told her she was too sensitive before hanging up. Marla brushed it off when I told her, saying people laughed because they admired my honesty, while Tessa congratulated me for being fearless. Later that day, Maya handed me a drawing of a sad face and asked if Daddy was in trouble, and I told her he was only tired from schoolwork, but her eyes lingered on me, like she knew more. At pickup, another mother asked if things were all right at home, because Ethan seemed so withdrawn, and I snapped back that people needed to mind their own marriages. That evening, Ethan asked if there was someone else, and I rolled my eyes and told him he was imagining things, though his steady stare unsettled me more than any accusation could. I told Tessa later that he was weak and predictable, and she laughed, saying I still had all the power, but her words did little to calm the tightness in my chest. A few nights later, I saw Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through the home camera app, carefully pressing the save button before sliding his phone away. Something about his composure made me uneasy, but I smothered it with a drink and reminded myself that he had always been too passive to act. That same night, he slipped his wedding band from his finger and set it in the dish by the door before stepping outside for air, and I stood frozen, realizing something had shifted. I told myself it was another sulk, another empty threat meant to scare me, and I messaged Tessa insisting that nothing had changed, but deep inside, I knew his silence had hardened into something I could not control. I told myself that the ring left in the dish meant nothing, but Ethan's silence grew heavier by the day, and I could feel it pressing against me, even while I laughed louder to drown it out. At the office, Liam leaned on my car after his shift and asked if I was finally ready to take a bigger step, and I teased him by saying Ethan should be grateful I had stayed with him this long, despite his stinginess. Liam's grin felt like proof that I was still desired, and I clung to it, though deep inside a ripple of unease kept surfacing no matter how much I ignored it. At home, Ethan carried his small notebook everywhere, jotting down times, receipts, and small details with careful handwriting, and when I asked what he was writing, he told me it was important to keep records. I snapped back that he was paranoid and accused him of being controlling, but he only nodded without argument, and his calmness unnerved me far more than any shouting ever could. One evening, he pointed out a hotel charge on our joint card, and I quickly claimed it had been a girls' night I generously covered, but when he asked who had been there, I listed names of women who were out of town. He stared at me for a long moment before saying he would confirm for himself, and I immediately accused him of trying to control me financially, twisting the blame as I always did. Later that week, he announced that accounts would be separated by Friday, and when I shouted that he was abandoning me, he calmly called the bank and began the process right in front of me. That night, he placed a thick manila folder on the kitchen counter before walking out to the garage, and when curiosity overcame me, I opened it to find highlighted statements, copied messages, and even transcript headers from a law office. My throat tightened as I flipped through the pages, but I told myself it was just another scare tactic, because Ethan had never been the type to follow through on threats. Meanwhile, Liam's text became bolder, asking if I was finally ready to be honest about us, And although I smiled at his words, I knew he had no plan beyond flattery, which made me uneasy in a way I had not felt before. Marla reminded me again that the house mattered more than anything, and that men were replaceable, and I repeated her words to myself like armor whenever panic stirred in my chest. Tessa told me not to feel guilty and to push harder, saying I deserved more than a man who spent evenings in silence, while Sylvia confronted me in the school parking lot and asked directly if Liam had been around the children. I snapped angrily that she was overstepping, but her suspicion cut deeper than I admitted, because I knew her sharp eyes saw through my stories. Maya asked quietly why her father had moved boxes into the garage, and I forced a smile and told her he was fixing shelves, though I knew he was carefully preparing for something I could not name. One night, Ethan mentioned selling his old car, reminding me that the title was in his name alone, and I mocked him by saying he was being dramatic, but he calmly explained that the sale would cover a deposit. My chest clenched as I suddenly understood he was preparing for a life separate from me, and I screamed that he was cruel for planning to abandon us. He only replied that the children needed stability, and that word echoed in my head like a judgment heavier than any insult. Each day, the manila folder on the counter grew thicker with receipts, statements, and witness notes, and though I kept laughing to Tessa and clinging to Liam's attention, I could feel my grip loosening as Ethan's silence no longer resembled surrender, but instead certainty. The morning the knock came at the door, I thought it was just a delivery, but instead, a man in a plain jacket handed me a heavy envelope while Sylvia and Walter sat on their porch watching with knowing eyes. My hands shook as I opened it at the kitchen counter and saw the words separation filing and custody petition stamped across the top, and inside were pages of exhibits that made my throat tighten. Ethan stood in the doorway, calm and composed, while I flipped through highlighted charges, transcripts, and affidavits that turned every joke and lie I had made into written proof. The first exhibit was the transcript from our backyard dinner, recorded by the outdoor camera, with my own words printed in bold letters, where I declared that my body belonged to whoever tried. The second was the hotel charge, circled in red, followed by signed statements from every woman I had claimed to be with that night, each confirming they had not been there. The third was a set of time clock records from my office, proving I had signed out early, on nights I insisted I was working late, neatly matched with photos of me at the Stag's Tail, sitting close to Liam, my bracelet glinting beside his drink. The fourth was a selection of my messages with Tessa, highlighted in yellow, where I wrote that Ethan was cheap and that I deserved excitement, which looked damning when pulled from the screen and printed on paper. I tried to say it was all out of context, but Ethan said calmly that mediation was already scheduled, and his steady tone felt sharper than shouting. I told him we should start fresh, but he said the accounts had to be separated immediately. And when I accused him of controlling me, he calmly called the bank and froze the cards while I stood there speechless. By the afternoon, I was scrambling to cover groceries and bills, while Ethan moved around the house with quiet certainty, never raising his voice. Tessa told me to tell people that Ethan was insecure and jealous so that others would pity me, and Marla repeated that I must never give up the house no matter what. Sylvia, however, praised Ethan openly, telling anyone who asked that he had finally done what needed to be done, and Walter nodded quietly beside her as if nothing more needed to be said. At mediation, his lawyer, Rachel Ford, spread out the evidence with precise order, each page numbered, each affidavit notarized, while Ethan sat with folded hands as if the outcome was already set. I argued that my comments were only jokes, that Ethan was cold and unromantic, but the mediator cut me off and said the case was about stability for the children, not my frustrations. I claimed that I was the victim of neglect, but every excuse shrank next to the pile of receipts, photos, and transcripts, and even Tessa sounded less confident when I told her how badly it had gone. Marla promised that we could appeal, but when I asked her for real help with money, she fell silent, and I realized no one would rescue me. Outside the office, Sylvia stopped me, looked me in the eye, and told me her son had been patient long enough, and her words stung more than her sharp tone usually did. The mediator ended by saying the case would move to court for temporary orders, and Ethan calmly marked the date in his phone while I bit my lip to hold back tears. That evening, he packed half the children's clothes into boxes labeled with their names, folding each shirt and pair of pants with care. And when I accused him of abandoning us, he replied evenly that they needed consistency. He carried the boxes to his car, while Sylvia and Walter stood on their porch, watching silently, and the sight of their calm faces made me feel like I was already defeated. When he closed the trunk without looking at me, I finally understood that my words and my laughter had no power against the evidence he had built, and that the law was already taking his side. The courthouse felt colder than I expected, with polished floors that echoed every step and rows of benches filled with people whose futures were being decided, and I knew the moment I walked in that charm would mean nothing here. Ethan sat across from me with his lawyer, Rachel Ford, calm and organized, while I sat with my own attorney, whispering that I needed to keep my answers short and steady, though my hand shook as I held a pen. The judge began by asking about the children's routines, and Ethan presented detailed schedules for Maya and Jonah, including bedtime charts, homework logs, and meal plans, each one color-coded and neatly tabbed. I tried to say Ethan had grown distant and unromantic, but the judge asked directly for evidence of neglect, and all I had were feelings, not facts. Rachel then presented the first exhibit, the transcript from the backyard dinner party, where I had loudly said my body belonged to whoever tried, and the judge frowned as the words were read aloud, with guest affidavits attached. The next exhibit was the hotel charge, highlighted and matched with signed statements from every woman I had named as company, each confirming they were not there, which made me look dishonest instead of clever. Then came the office time clock records, proving I had signed out early on nights I claimed to be working overtime, paired with photos of me at the Stag's Tail, seated beside Liam, my bracelet visible on the table. I said the photos were misleading, but the timestamps matched perfectly, and the judge wrote notes without looking at me. Finally, witness statements from the birthday dinner were read aloud, describing how I mocked Ethan again in public while he sat humiliated, and I felt the heat rising in my face as the words echoed in the courtroom. My attorney tried to argue that Ethan was controlling with money, but the judge dismissed it, saying financial prudence was not abuse, especially when paired with careful planning for the children. When the ruling came, it landed like a stone in my chest. Ethan was granted primary custody during the week. I was given alternating weekends, and the judge imposed a condition banning unrelated overnight guests when the children were present. Our accounts were officially separated, and the judge ordered that all communication go through the parenting app so everything would be logged and recorded. I sat frozen as the gavel struck, while Ethan remained calm, not even glancing at me, as if I had already been written out of the story. Sylvia reached over and clasped his hand proudly. Walter nodded with approval, while Marla leaned close to whisper that we would appeal, though my attorney shook her head and said there was nothing left to challenge. Maya asked softly, in court, if her bedtime would stay the same, and Ethan reassured her by showing the schedule again, while I sat powerless, unable to contradict him. Jonah clung tightly to Ethan's leg as we left the courthouse, refusing to let go until he was buckled into the car, and I stood on the steps watching helplessly. Outside in the parking lot, Ethan loaded the labeled boxes of the children's clothes into his car with steady hands, his movements practiced and calm, while I stood at the curb with crossed arms. I told him he was cruel for taking the children away during the week, but he replied evenly that we were following the court's orders. Then he closed the trunk with a sound that felt final. His phone chimed with a deposit notification from the sale of his old car, the very money that had funded the lawyer and the apartment, and he slipped it into his pocket without looking at me. Sylvia and Walter stood nearby, silent but firm, while Marla tugged at my arm and whispered that I could still fix things somehow, though I knew it was a lie. The story I thought I controlled had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced by receipts, transcripts, affidavits, and orders that no laughter could erase. As Ethan drove away with Maya, and Jonah buckled in the back seat according to the new schedule, I stood staring at the empty space in front of the courthouse, knowing he had walked away with everything while I was left holding nothing but my own. Bitter words. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.